If you touch her, sir, you might be touching the biggest mistake of your life." The words didn't come out loud at first. They lived in Ava Johnson's throat, caught somewhere between fear and something stronger, something older than fear. The crystal glass slipped from Richard Cole's hand and shattered softly against the marble floor, the sound sharp but quickly swallowed by the vast, echoing lobby. Every eye turned, not because of the glass, but because of the silence that followed. Richard stood tall in his tailored navy suit, 6'2", shoulders squared, jaw tight with irritation that had nothing to do with the spill. In front of him, a frail woman stood frozen, her coat too thin for the February cold, her hands trembling not from weakness, but from being seen too clearly in a place that never allowed people like her to exist. "I said move her out." Richard's voice cut through the air, calm but edged, the kind of calm that made people obey without question. Two security guards hesitated just a second before stepping forward. Ava noticed that hesitation. It was small, almost invisible, but it was there. She stood 10 feet away, a silver cleaning cart beside her, the faint scent of disinfectant still clinging to her uniform. She wasn't supposed to be part of this moment. People like her were trained to disappear, to become part of the background, like polished floors and spotless glass. But something in the woman's eyes stopped her. Not fear, not desperation, recognition, the kind that didn't belong between strangers. "Sir," Ava said, this time louder. Her voice didn't shake, but her fingers curled tightly around the edge of the cart, knuckles whitening against the metal. Richard didn't turn right away. He wasn't used to being interrupted, especially not by staff. Especially not by someone who wore a name tag instead of a title. "You're out of line," the floor manager hissed under his breath from across the lobby, eyes wide, warning her without saying it outright. Ava heard him. She just didn't listen. The woman in front of Richard lifted her gaze slowly, as if the weight of it had taken years to carry. "You have your father's eyes," she whispered, barely audible, but the words landed anyway. Ava felt it, not as sound, but as something deeper, something that didn't belong in coincidence. Richard's expression flickered, just for a fraction of a second. Then it hardened again, sharper than before. "Get her out," he repeated, this time quieter, more dangerous in its certainty. The guard stepped closer. Ava moved before she fully understood why. One step forward, then another. The wheels of her cart squeaked softly behind her as it rolled an inch across the marble. The distance between her and Richard closed. 10 feet, then 8, then 5. Her heartbeat was loud now, steady, deliberate, like it had already made the decision for her. "Sir," she said again, this time standing just within his line of sight. He turned. Finally, his eyes met hers, not curious, not patient, just mildly annoyed, like a man interrupted during something far more important. Ava swallowed once. Then she said it, clear, unshaken. "If you hit her, you'll regret it for the rest of your life." The lobby didn't just go quiet. It stilled, like even the air itself was waiting to see what he would do next. Richard Cole did not lower his hand right away, but he did not raise it either, and that hesitation was enough to shift something invisible in the room as the guard slowed, just slightly, as if waiting for a clearer signal that never came, and Ava stood there with her shoulders squared even though the fabric of her uniform felt suddenly too thin against the weight of every eye now fixed on her while the manager took a step forward, his voice tight and controlled as he said her name like a warning. Ava, step back, now. But she did not move because the woman in front of Richard had begun to breathe differently, slower, like someone who had been holding something in for years and was finally too tired to keep it buried. And when Richard spoke again, his tone had changed, not softer but more precise, more focused. "You are interrupting a private matter," he said, looking directly at Ava as if trying to place her, categorize her, reduce her to something manageable, and Ava felt that. Look but did not shrink from it. Instead, she lifted her chin just enough to meet his gaze fully, something she had never done with a guest before, and she said, "Sir, with respect, she is not a disturbance." And the word hung there, not loud, not dramatic, just steady, and that steadiness unsettled more than defiance ever could as a few people in the lobby shifted their weight, the faint sound of leather shoes against marble echoing in the quiet. And the woman reached into the pocket of her worn coat with slow, careful fingers, as if any sudden movement might break whatever fragile moment had formed. And she pulled out something small, something wrapped in tissue that had been folded and unfolded too many times. And she held it out, but not toward Ava, toward Richard, her hand trembling just enough to catch the light from the chandelier above. And for a second no one moved, not even Richard, until his eyes flicked downward almost involuntarily, drawn by something he could not yet explain, and Ava noticed it, that shift, that almost invisible pull, and it confirmed what she had already begun to feel in her chest, like a quiet certainty building under pressure. And the woman spoke again, her voice thin but clear. "I kept this," she said, and there was no accusation in it, no demand, just a statement that carried weight because of how little force it used. And Richard's jaw tightened, not in anger but in resistance, like a man trying to hold on to a version of reality that was starting to slip. And the manager stepped closer now, lowering his voice but sharpening it further. "Security, remove her," he said, but again the guards hesitated. And that hesitation spread like a ripple as one of the guests near the front desk leaned slightly to get a better look, curiosity replacing indifference. And Ava took one more step forward, placing herself not in front of Richard, not yet, but close enough that her presence could not be ignored. And she said quietly, "Sir, just look at what she is holding." And it was not a command, it was an invitation, but it carried something deeper, something that made refusal feel heavier than compliance. And Richard exhaled slowly through his nose, a controlled breath, then reached out, not fully, just enough that his fingers hovered inches from the object. In the woman's hand, and for the first time since the moment began, the power in the room did not feel like it belonged entirely to him anymore. It felt suspended, shared, uncertain, like the outcome had not yet decided who would stand and who would fall. Richard's fingers stopped just short of the object, hovering in the space between doubt and control, and for a moment it looked like he might pull back, like he might choose not to see. But something in the woman's eyes held him there, not pleading, not demanding, just waiting, and that kind of patience carried a different kind of weight, the kind that did not rush truth but made it impossible to ignore. And slowly, almost reluctantly, he took it from her hand, the tissue soft against his fingertips, worn thin at the edges as if it had been unfolded 100 times before, and the lobby seemed to lean in without moving, every breath quieter than the last as he peeled back the paper with precise, controlled movements, revealing a small silver locket, old, slightly tarnished, but intact. And the moment it caught the light, something shifted across his face, not recognition yet, but disruption, like a memory brushing against the edge of his awareness. And Ava saw it. The way his posture changed just enough, the way his shoulders no longer carried the same certainty they had seconds ago. And the woman spoke again, softer this time. "You used to hold it when you were scared," she said, and the words did not echo. They settled, deep and quiet, and Richard's thumb pressed against the surface of the locket, feeling its edges, its weight, as if his hand remembered something his mind had not yet caught up to. And he opened it, the hinge resisting slightly before giving way, and inside, there was a photograph, faded, but clear enough, a young woman holding a baby wrapped in a light blue blanket. And for the first time since this began, Richard did not speak, he did not command, he did not correct, he just looked, and the silence stretched, not empty, but full, heavy with something that no one else in the room could fully understand. And Ava felt her heartbeat slow, not because the tension had eased, but because it had deepened into something more fragile, more dangerous. And behind her, the manager stopped, moving altogether, his authority suspended by uncertainty. And one of the guards shifted his stance, no longer reaching forward, no longer certain what he was supposed to do. And the woman lowered her hand slowly, now empty, her fingers curling inward as if letting go had cost her something. "And," she said, "I never meant to leave you." And there was no defense in it, no explanation, just a truth offered without protection. And Richard's jaw tightened again, but differently now, not in anger, but in resistance to something he could not easily dismiss. And he glanced at Ava, just for a second, as if trying to understand why she had stepped in, why she had seen something he had missed. And Ava did not look away, because she knew this moment was not about proving anything. It was about holding the line long enough for the truth to reach him. And she said quietly, Sir, sometimes what looks like nothing is everything someone lost. And the words landed without force, but they stayed, and Richard looked back down at the locket, his grip tightening just slightly. And for the first time, the man who controlled rooms, deals, and decisions stood still in a way that felt unfamiliar, like control itself had paused, waiting for him to decide whether he would hold on to it or let something else in. Richard closed the locket, but his fingers did not release it. They held on to it like it had weight far beyond metal and memory. And for a moment he said nothing, just stood there with his gaze fixed somewhere between the object in his hand and the space in front of him where the woman still stood, waiting without stepping closer, without asking for anything more. And that restraint unsettled him more than any demand ever could, because it left the next move entirely in his control, and control, for the first time in a long time, did not feel steady. It felt uncertain, and he drew in a slow breath before finally speaking, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier sharpness. "Where did you get this?" he asked, not looking at her when he said it. And the question did not sound like disbelief. It sounded like something closer to caution, as if he already knew the answer might matter more than he wanted it to. And the woman's lips parted slightly before she answered. "It was yours," she said simply, and the words landed without force but carried something that made the air feel heavier again. And behind them someone shifted, a quiet movement near the front desk, but no one interrupted. No one dared break whatever this moment had become, and Ava remained where she was, her presence steady, her hands now relaxed at her sides, but her posture still firm, like she was holding the space open without stepping into it. And Richard let out a faint breath that almost sounded like a short laugh. But there was no humor in it, just disbelief trying to find its footing. "That is not possible," he said. And this time he did look at the woman, really look at her, taking in the lines on her face, the way her shoulders carried years that had not been kind, the way her eyes stayed fixed on him without fear. And something in that gaze unsettled him again, because it did not match the narrative he had already decided was true. And Ava saw the shift, the way his certainty was beginning to crack in places too small for anyone else to notice. And she spoke carefully, not to challenge him, but to steady the moment. "Sir, sometimes what we are told is not the full story." And her voice was calm, measured, the kind that did not push but did not retreat either. And the manager took another step forward, clearly struggling to regain control of the situation, his voice tight as he said, "Mr. Cole, we can handle this privately." But Richard did not respond to him, did not even acknowledge him, his attention still locked on the woman in front of him, as if everything else in the room had faded out of relevance. And the woman took a small step forward now, not enough to invade his space, just enough to close the distance by an inch, and she said, "They told you I was gone." And there was no accusation in her tone, only a quiet statement of fact. And Richard's expression tightened again, his grip on the locket firming just slightly as he replied, "Because you were." And the words came quickly, almost reflexively, like something he had said before, something he had believed for so long it had become automatic. And the woman shook her head once, slow, deliberate. "No," she said, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than a long explanation ever could. And the room held its breath again, the silence stretching as two versions of the same truth stood facing each other, neither loud, neither forceful, but both impossible to ignore. And Ava felt it then, the moment shifting from confrontation into something deeper, something that would not resolve with authority or dismissal, something that required listening. And she took a quiet step back, not retreating, but making space, because she understood now that this was no longer her moment to speak. It was his moment to decide whether he would keep holding on to what he had always known, or finally question it. Richard did not answer right away, and that silence said more than anything he could have said, because it stretched too long for dismissal and too heavy for indifference. And his eyes dropped once more to the locket in his hand, as if it had become something unfamiliar, something that no longer fit cleanly into the version of his life he had always accepted without question. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried less certainty, not weaker but searching. "If what you are saying is true," he said slowly, "then where have you been?" And it was not an accusation, not yet. It was something closer to a fracture in his understanding, And the woman exhaled softly as if she had been waiting years for that exact question, not because it would fix anything, but because it meant he had finally opened the door just enough to ask. And she answered without stepping closer, without trying to close the distance that still stood between them. Everywhere they said I was not, she said, and the words did not rush, they settled. And Richard's brow tightened as if trying to process something that did not fit neatly into facts or reports or records. And Ava watched him carefully, noticing how his shoulders no longer held the same rigid line, how his stance had shifted just slightly, as if the ground beneath him was no longer as solid as it had been minutes ago. And behind them the manager cleared his throat again, quieter this time, uncertain. Sir, perhaps we should move this conversation upstairs. But Richard did not move, did not respond, because for the first time the room did not matter, the people did not matter. The schedule he had been following no longer existed in the same way. And the woman reached up slowly, her hand hovering near the locket still in his grasp, not touching it, just close enough to acknowledge its presence. And she said, "They told you I chose to leave." And Richard's jaw tightened again. But this time there was hesitation behind it, a pause that had not been there before, and he replied, "That is what I was told." And the difference in his tone was small but unmistakable. It was no longer a statement of fact. It was a repetition of something learned, and Ava felt it, that shift. The moment when belief begins to separate from truth, and the woman nodded once, slowly, as if confirming something to herself rather than to him. "I did not choose that," she said, and the simplicity of it landed heavier than any detailed explanation, and Richard looked at her again, really looked, not as a problem to solve, not as a disruption to remove, but as someone who might carry a part of his story he had never questioned. And for a brief second something passed through his expression, something close to uncertainty, something almost human in its vulnerability, and Ava saw it and understood. That this was the edge, the moment where he could either step forward into something unknown or step back into the safety of what he had always believed. And she did not speak this time. She did not need to, because the room itself seemed to hold that question in the air, waiting, and Richard's grip on the locket loosened just slightly, not enough to drop it, but enough to show that whatever control he thought he had over this moment was no longer absolute. And he said quietly, almost to himself, "Then someone lied." And the words did not echo, they settled into the silence like a truth that had been waiting longer than anyone in the room had realized. The words lingered in the air, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, and Richard did not move as he stared at the locket in his hand like it had rewritten something inside him that could not be easily undone. And the woman watched him quietly, not pressing, not rushing, just standing there with a kind of patience that only comes from waiting too long already. And Ava could feel the shift fully now. The moment had crossed from confrontation into something deeper, something fragile, and she took a slow breath, the faint scent of cleaning solution still grounding her as her eyes moved between them, watching carefully, because she knew how easily this could collapse if pushed too hard. And Richard finally looked up again, his gaze sharper now, but not in anger, in focus. "Who?" he asked, and the single word carried weight, because it was no longer about denial. It was about truth, and the woman did not answer right away, her eyes lowering for a brief second before lifting again, steady. "The people who raised you," she said, and there was no bitterness in it, no accusation, just a statement that landed heavier because of how calm it was. And Richard's expression tightened, not defensive, but conflicted, like something inside him had begun to resist what he had always accepted. And he shook his head once, slow. "That does not make sense," he said, but the certainty was gone, replaced by something quieter, something uncertain, and Ava saw it clearly now, the shift from control to questioning. And she spoke gently, not stepping forward, not stepping back, just enough to keep the moment from slipping away. "Sir, sometimes the truth is not what we were given. It is what was hidden." And her voice was steady, soft, but it carried, and Richard glanced at her again, longer this time, not with irritation, not with dismissal, but with something closer to recognition, like he was beginning to understand why she had stepped in, why she had not stayed silent like everyone else in the room. And behind them, the manager stood frozen, his authority gone quiet, unsure of where to place himself in a moment that no longer followed the rules he understood. and one of the guards shifted again, lowering his stance, no longer prepared to act, because there was nothing left to remove, nothing left to control, and the woman took a small breath before speaking again, her voice softer now. "I came back every year," she said, and Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in focus. "Every year," she repeated, "on your birthday," and the words landed like something distant becoming suddenly close, and Richard's fingers tightened around the locket again. But this time not in resistance, in connection, like something inside him was beginning to align with what he was hearing, and Ava noticed the smallest detail, his thumb brushing the edge of the locket again, slower now, almost unconsciously, and it told her everything. She needed to know that the wall was no longer solid, that something had already begun to break through, and Richard spoke again, quieter, almost careful. "Why did I never see you?" And it was not a challenge, not an accusation. It was a question that carried something deeper, something close to regret even before the answer came. And the woman's eyes softened, not with relief, not yet, but with something like recognition. "Because they made sure you would not," she said, and the truth of it did not need explanation. It settled into the silence around them, filling the space where certainty used to live, and Ava stood there, still, knowing that this was the moment that would change everything, not with noise, not with force, but with something quieter, something that could not be taken back once it was seen. Richard did not look away this time, and that alone changed the space between them, not smaller but clearer, as if something that had been blurred for years was finally coming into focus, and his grip on the locket shifted again, not tight, not defensive, just present, like he was holding on to something real instead of something remembered. And the noise of the lobby, the distant hum of conversations, the soft chime of the elevator doors, all of it seemed to fade into the background as his attention locked fully onto the woman in front of him, and Ava noticed how still he had become, not the stillness of control, but the stillness of someone listening for the first time. And the woman spoke again, her voice carrying that same quiet steadiness that had not wavered since the beginning. "I waited outside the school once," she said, and the words landed gently, almost like they were meant for him alone. And Richard's brow tightened slightly, a flicker of something passing through his expression, not recognition yet, but something close to it. And she continued, "You were 8 years old, wearing a navy sweater with your name stitched on the inside." And Ava saw it then, the shift, small but undeniable, as Richard's eyes moved just slightly to the side, like he was searching through something he had not touched in years, and his voice, when it came, was quieter than before. "I had a sweater like that," he said, almost under his breath, and the woman nodded once. Not triumphant, not relieved, just confirming. "You dropped your lunchbox that day," she added. "It rolled under the bench, and you did not want to reach for it because the other kids were watching." And Richard exhaled slowly, a breath that seemed to carry more weight than the ones before it, and his fingers brushed the edge of the locket again, slower now, more deliberate, and Ava could feel the moment deepening, not breaking, not collapsing, but unfolding, and she stayed silent, knowing that anything she said now would only interrupt something that needed to happen on its own. And the woman's eyes softened slightly, not with pity, not with sadness, but with something warmer, something patient. "I picked it up for you," she said. "You did not look at me, but you said thank you." And Richard closed his eyes for just a second, not long enough for anyone else to notice. But Ava saw it, the way his expression shifted, the way his shoulders lowered just a fraction, and when he opened them again there was something different there, something less certain, less guarded, and he asked, "Why did you not come closer?" And the question was not sharp, not accusing. It was something else now, something searching, and the woman answered without hesitation. "Because they were watching," she said, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than any explanation could, and Richard's jaw tightened again, but not in resistance, in realization, and the space between what he had been told and what he was beginning to understand grew wider with every word, and behind them someone shifted again, but no one spoke, no one interrupted, because whatever was happening now no longer belonged to the room. It belonged to the truth that was slowly, carefully, finding its way to the surface, and Ava stood there, steady and quiet, knowing that this was no longer about proving anything. It was about allowing something real to be seen, and for the first time since this began, Richard did not look like a man in control. He looked like someone trying to understand how much of his life had been built on something he had never questioned until now. Richard did not speak for several seconds, and in that silence something inside him continued to shift, not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily, like a foundation that had been quietly cracking now beginning to give way under its own weight. And his eyes stayed on the woman, as if looking away would allow everything she had said to fall apart. And Ava could see it clearly now. The moment had moved past doubt into something more dangerous, something that could not be undone once accepted. And Richard finally took a slow breath, his chest rising and falling in a way that no longer matched the composed rhythm he had carried before. And he said, "If they knew," pausing as if choosing the words carefully, "why would they keep you away?" And the question carried something deeper now, something closer to disbelief at the possibility rather than rejection of it. And the woman's gaze softened again, but there was no comfort in it, only truth. And she answered, "Because I had nothing they could use." And the words landed quietly, but they cut through the space with a clarity that made them impossible to ignore. And Richard's expression tightened, not in anger, but in understanding that was beginning to form whether he wanted it to or not. And Ava felt a chill move through her arms despite the warmth of the lobby lights, because she recognized that kind of realization, the kind that does not come all at once but settles piece by piece until it becomes undeniable. And the woman continued, her voice still steady. "They had money, connections, influence," she said. "I had none of that. Only you." And Richard's fingers shifted again around the locket, his thumb pressing lightly against its surface as if grounding himself in something physical, while everything else began to feel uncertain. And he looked down at it once more before asking, quieter now, "Why keep coming back?" And the question no longer sounded like doubt. It sounded like something else, something closer to longing. And the woman's lips curved just slightly, not into a smile, but into something softer, something worn but real. "Because leaving once does not mean you stop loving," she said, and the words did not echo. They settled, deep and steady. And Ava felt her breath catch for just a moment, not because the statement was dramatic, but because it was simple, and that simplicity carried more truth than anything else that had been said. And Richard looked at her again, fully this time, and whatever he saw there held him, not with force, not with demand, but with something that could not be dismissed as coincidence or confusion. And behind them the manager had stopped trying to intervene altogether, his presence now reduced to silence. And even the guards stood still, their earlier purpose forgotten in the face of something they did not understand but instinctively knew not to interrupt. And Ava took a small step back, giving the space entirely to them now, because she understood that this moment no longer needed protection, it needed time. And Richard's voice came again, softer than before, almost careful. "What is your name?" And the question changed everything, not because of its words, but because of what it meant. And the woman answered without hesitation, "Evelyn," she said. And for a brief second Richard's expression shifted again, something flickering across it that had not been there before, something closer to recognition than doubt. And he repeated it under his breath, "Evelyn," as if testing the sound of it, as if measuring how it fit into something he had never questioned until now. And Ava watched quietly, knowing that the moment had crossed into something irreversible, something that no longer depended on proof or argument, but on whether he was ready to accept what had already begun to feel true. Richard repeated the name once more, quieter this time, as if saying it differently might change what it meant. "Evelyn." And the sound of it settled somewhere deeper than he expected, not in memory exactly, but close enough to disturb it. And his eyes stayed on her, searching now, not for proof, but for something familiar, something that could anchor everything she had said into something real. And Ava watched carefully as his posture shifted again, not rigid anymore, not defensive, but uncertain in a way that did not belong to the man who had walked into this lobby minutes ago. And the silence stretched just long enough to feel fragile before Richard spoke again. "That name," he said slowly. "I have heard it before." And it was not a declaration, it was an admission. And Evelyn nodded once, gently, as if she had expected that moment to come. "They did not erase everything," she said. And there was no triumph in her voice, only quiet understanding, and Richard exhaled through his nose, a breath that felt heavier than the ones before, and he glanced down at the locket again, turning it slightly in his hand as if trying to see it from a different angle, as if a new perspective might unlock something that had been hidden in plain sight all along. And Ava noticed the smallest detail again, the way his fingers no longer held it tightly, but carefully, almost like it mattered now, and she stayed silent, knowing this moment did not need words from her anymore. It needed space, and Richard looked back up at Evelyn, his eyes narrowing slightly, not in suspicion, but in concentration. "Why now?" he asked, and the question carried something deeper, something closer to vulnerability than challenge. And Evelyn took a slow breath before answering, her gaze never leaving his. "Because you were about to walk past me again," she said, and the simplicity of it landed with a quiet weight that filled the space between them, and Richard's expression shifted again, something flickering across it that had not been there before, something closer to realization, and he looked around briefly, as if noticing the room again for the first time since this began, the people standing still, the staff watching quietly, the world that had paused without his permission, and then his gaze returned to her, more focused now, more present, and he asked, softer this time, "How many times?" And Evelyn's lips pressed together for a brief second before she answered, "Enough to know you would not recognize me," she said, and there was no bitterness in it, just truth, and that truth settled into Richard's expression in a way that did not break him, but changed him, and Ava saw it clearly. The moment where denial no longer had anywhere to stand, and Richard's shoulders lowered slightly, not in defeat, but in acceptance of something he could no longer ignore, and he looked down at the locket one more time before closing it gently, the click of it soft but final. And when he looked back up again, his voice had changed, not loud, not commanding, but steady in a different way. "If this is true," he said, pausing just long enough to let the weight of the words settle, "then I need to know everything." And the room did not react. No one moved, because something in the way he said it made it clear that this was no longer a situation to control or dismiss. It was something else entirely, something that required listening. And Evelyn nodded slowly, not relieved, not yet, but ready, and Ava stood quietly at the edge of it all, knowing that the moment she stepped into had done what it needed to do, not by force, not by argument, but by holding the truth in place long enough for it to be seen. Richard did not move immediately after speaking, and that stillness carried a different kind of authority now, not the kind that commanded rooms, but the kind that held space for something uncertain, and for the first time since this began, he stepped back instead of forward, just one step, subtle but unmistakable, creating distance not to push Evelyn away, but to see her more clearly, and Ava noticed it, the shift in position. The way control was no longer about dominance, but about understanding. And Richard turned slightly, his gaze cutting across the lobby toward the front desk where his assistant stood frozen with a tablet still in hand, and he said, calm but firm, "Cancel the meeting." And the words landed with quiet finality, not raised, not repeated, but absolute, and the assistant hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding quickly, already moving, already adjusting. Because even in uncertainty, his decisions still carried weight, but now that weight was being redirected. And Richard turned back, his attention returning fully to Evelyn, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed again, not softened, but grounded in something more deliberate. "We are not having this conversation out here," he said, glancing briefly at the people still watching, the quiet crowd that had formed without stepping too close, and then his eyes returned to her, steady. "Come with me." And it was not a command, not entirely. It was something closer to an invitation that carried urgency, and Evelyn did not move right away, her gaze searching his face as if measuring whether this shift was real, whether it would hold, and Ava could see that hesitation, the weight of years pressing into a single moment, and Richard seemed to understand it too because he did not repeat himself, did not push, he simply waited. And that waiting said more than any reassurance could have, and after a second, Evelyn nodded once, small but certain, and took a step forward, and that step changed something in the room, not visibly, but in the way the tension shifted from public to private, from spectacle to truth, and Richard turned slightly toward the hallway that led to the private offices, But then he paused, just for a moment, and looked back at Ava, and it was not a passing glance, not the kind given to staff out of habit. It was direct, intentional. And for a second neither of them spoke, and Ava felt it. The acknowledgement, not spoken but clear. And Richard gave a slight nod, almost imperceptible, before turning away again. And Ava did not respond outwardly. She did not need to, because she understood what that nod meant, not gratitude in words, but recognition in action. And as Richard and Evelyn began to walk, the guards stepped aside without being told. Their earlier purpose dissolved completely, and the manager remained where he was, silent now, watching something unfold that no longer followed any script he understood. And Ava stayed by her cart, her hands resting lightly on the handle, her breathing steady again. But her eyes followed them as they moved down the hallway, their figures gradually disappearing from the open space of the lobby into something more contained, more private. And as the sound of their footsteps faded against the polished floor, the room slowly began to breathe again, conversations returning in low murmurs, movement resuming in careful steps. But Ava remained still for a moment longer, because she knew that what had just happened would not end in that hallway. It would continue, deeper, quieter, and far more difficult than anything that had already been said. And somewhere ahead, behind closed doors, a man who had built his life on certainty was about to confront the possibility that everything he believed about where he came from had been carefully, deliberately rewritten. The door to the private office closed with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have, sealing the space from the distant noise of the lobby and leaving behind a silence that felt heavier, more contained. And Richard stood near the center of the room for a moment without speaking, his back half turned as if he needed a second to gather something he had never had to gather before. And Evelyn remained near the door, not stepping further in, not assuming anything, just waiting the way she had learned to wait over years that had offered her no guarantees. And the room itself was immaculate, polished wood desk, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, everything in its place, everything controlled. And yet none of it seemed to matter now. And Ava's absence was noticeable in a quiet way, not because she had been central, but because she had held the moment steady. And now it belonged fully to them. And Richard finally turned, his expression different now, not composed in the way it had been in public, but more exposed, like the edges had softened just enough to let something real through. And he walked toward the desk slowly, placing the locket down on its surface with care, not setting it aside, but placing it where it could be seen. And when he spoke his voice was measured, but no longer distant. "Start from the beginning," he said, and the words were simple. But they carried weight because they were not a demand for proof. They were a request for truth. And Evelyn took a small step forward, just enough to stand across from him, her hands resting loosely at her sides. And she nodded once before speaking. "They told me you were going to a better life," she said. And her voice did not break, did not falter. It stayed steady, and Richard's eyes remained on her, focused, listening. And she continued, "They said I could not give you what you needed, and maybe they were right about that." And she paused for a brief second, not to gather emotion, but to choose her next words carefully. "But they did not tell you I tried to come back." And Richard's jaw tightened slightly, not in resistance, but in reaction to something that felt too close to ignore. And he asked, "Why did you not fight it?" And the question came quietly, not accusing, but searching, and Evelyn's gaze did not waver. "Because I had nothing to fight with," she said. And the simplicity of it settled heavily in the room, and Richard looked down briefly at the locket on his desk before looking back up again. And something in his posture shifted, not collapsing, but adjusting, like he was trying to make room for a truth that did not fit easily into the structure he had built his life on. And he moved his hand slightly closer to the locket without touching it, as if its presence anchored him. And he asked again, softer now, "And all these years," and Evelyn nodded before he finished. "I watched from a distance," she said. And the words carried no expectation, no request for sympathy, just fact. And Richard exhaled slowly, the sound quiet but full, and he stepped back from the desk, not to create distance, but because standing still had become too heavy. And he walked toward the window, his reflection faint in the glass. A man who had always known exactly who he was now facing the possibility that part of that identity had been built on something incomplete. And he stood there for a moment, looking out but not seeing the city. And then he spoke again, not turning back yet. "Everything I was told," he said. "Everything I believed." And he paused, the sentence unfinished, because the weight of it did not need to be fully spoken, and Evelyn did not respond. She did not fill the silence, because she understood that this part was not hers to guide. It was his to confront. And after a few seconds, Richard turned back slowly, his expression no longer guarded, no longer certain, but something else entirely, something closer to honest. And he looked at her, really looked, and said quietly, "I need to know what is real." And the room held that statement in stillness, because for the first time, the man who had always controlled the narrative was asking to hear one he had never been given. Richard stood there with the weight of his own words settling around him. And for the first time in his life, the silence did not feel like control. It felt like exposure, like standing in a room where nothing could be hidden behind titles or achievements or the careful structure he had built over decades. And Evelyn did not rush to fill it. She did not step forward or soften what she had already said. She simply remained where she was, present, steady, and that steadiness made it impossible for him to retreat back into what was familiar. And after a few seconds he moved again, slowly, returning to the desk, his hand hovering briefly over the locket before resting beside it instead of on it, as if he was learning to approach the truth without trying to control it. And he looked at her again, his gaze no longer searching for flaws or inconsistencies, but for understanding, and he said quietly, "Tell me what happened after." And the question carried something different now, not doubt, not resistance, but a willingness to listen that had not existed before. And Evelyn nodded once, her eyes holding his without hesitation. "They told me you were gone," she said, "that everything was final, that I should move on." And her voice remained calm, but there was a depth to it now, something that carried years without needing to explain them. And Richard's jaw tightened slightly as he listened, not in rejection, but in reaction to something that was beginning to settle into place whether he wanted it to or not. And she continued, "I tried to find you," she said, "but every door was closed before I could even knock." And the words were simple, but they carried a quiet finality that made them feel heavier than anything dramatic could have. And Richard lowered his gaze for a moment, his eyes falling to the polished surface of the desk where the reflection of the locket caught the light. And Ava's words from earlier seemed to echo somewhere in his mind, not as sound, but as presence. And he took a slow breath before speaking again, softer now. "And you never stopped." And it was not a question, it was something closer to realization. And Evelyn shook her head gently. "No," she said. And that single word carried more weight than any explanation could have. And Richard's hand moved then, finally touching the locket again. But this time not with tension, not with hesitation, just with acceptance. And he opened it once more, looking at the photograph inside. But now he was not searching for proof. He was looking at it as something that belonged to him in a way he had never allowed himself to consider before. And when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, but steadier in a different way. "I built everything on what I was told," he said, and the admission hung in the air, not defensive, not proud, just honest. And Evelyn watched him without interruption, because she understood that this was not about correcting him. It was about allowing him to see. And Richard closed the locket. Slowly, the soft click marking something subtle but irreversible. And he looked up at her again, his expression no longer guarded, no longer divided, but something else entirely, something closer to clarity. And he said, "I cannot change what was done," pausing just long enough for the truth of it to settle. "But I can decide what happens now." And the room held that statement in stillness, because it was not a promise, not yet, but it was the first step towards something that had been denied for too long. And Evelyn's eyes softened slightly, not with relief, but with recognition, because she knew that this was the moment where everything could begin to change, not through force, not through proof, but through a choice that could no longer be avoided. The room did not change, but something inside it did, something quiet and irreversible. And Richard stood there with the locket resting in his palm, no longer an object to question, but something he had already begun to accept without needing every answer first. And for a moment neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing left to say, but because what had already been said needed space to settle. and Evelyn remained where she was, her posture unchanged, her presence steady in a way that did not demand anything from him. And that absence of demand made his next step entirely his own, and slowly, almost carefully, Richard moved around the desk, closing the distance between them not with urgency, not with hesitation, but with intention, and when he stopped a few feet away, he did not look down at the floor, did not glance toward the door, he kept his eyes on her, and there was no authority left in that gaze, no expectation of control, only something quieter, something more honest. And he held the locket out toward her, not returning it, not giving it away, but sharing it, as if the space between them could now hold something that belonged to both of them. And Evelyn's hand lifted slowly, her fingers brushing the edge of it before resting there, not taking it fully, just touching it. And that small contact carried more weight than anything else that had happened in the room, because it was not about proof. It was about connection, and Richard's voice, when it came, was low, steady, but different from anything he had spoken before. "I do not know how to fix what was taken from us," he said, and the words were not polished, not prepared. They were real in a way that did not need refinement, and Evelyn's eyes softened, not with relief, but with understanding, because she had never come here expecting something to be fixed, only to be seen, and Richard continued, "But I am not walking away again." And the statement settled between them, not as a promise to solve everything, but as a decision that could not be undone once made. And Evelyn nodded once, her fingers still resting lightly against the locket, and the silence that followed was no longer heavy. It was quiet in a different way, something closer to stillness than tension, and outside the office the world had already begun to return to its rhythm, footsteps, voices, the distant hum of movement. But inside, time felt slower, more deliberate. And after a moment Richard stepped slightly to the side, not to create distance, but to open the space beside him. A gesture small enough to go unnoticed by anyone else, but clear enough to mean something. And Evelyn understood it without words, taking a single step forward, not as a guest, not as a stranger, but as someone who was no longer being kept outside. And across the lobby, far from the office door, Ava stood by her cart, her hands resting lightly against the handle, her eyes lifting just slightly as if she could feel the shift even from a distance, and she did not smile, did not react outwardly. She simply exhaled, slow and quiet, and returned to her work, because she knew that what mattered had already happened, not in the words, not in the proof, but in the moment someone chose to listen instead of dismiss, to see instead of ignore, and somewhere behind a closed door, a man who had once defined power by control had begun to understand something else entirely. That the strength he had been searching for was never in what he could command, but in what he was finally willing to face.